What complicated grief means, it does involve a little bit of knowing kind of what typical grief is. Sometimes it might be that somebody is really trying to actively avoid the painful feelings that grief brings up, and so they might be turning to drugs or alcohol. Some people, when they're depressed, they feel more agitated. It's not always that typical kind of hide under the duvet.
And is there circumstances perhaps in their life that might increase the likelihood of complicated grief? Welcome to the Life and Loss podcast, where we break down barriers surrounding discussions of death and grief, making listeners feel less alone. I'm Hannah, and today I'm joined by Melissa Girling, a clinical psychologist based at Forest Holme Hospice. In today's episode, we will discuss complicated grief, understanding when a professional intervention becomes a necessity, and how clinical psychology can play a critical role in healing. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me.
So today's subject is complicated grief. Can you start by explaining what complicated grief is and how it might differ from a typical grieving process?
Yeah, sure. I guess I wanted to start by saying that, the grieving experience it's a universal experience, but it's also a really unique experience as well to each individual. And so I guess talking about what complicated grief means, it does involve a little bit of knowing kind of what normal sort of or typical grief is. And I guess when we talk about complicated grief, it's grieving that may be, there's something getting in the way of that natural process of kind of coming to terms with the loss of somebody close to somebody. And it can take many forms, and there's a lot of overlap. So it's really important to kind of, allow people to go through that natural process, but intervene when it does seem like there's something stalling that process.
I've heard people say that they feel stuck within a certain point of their grieving process. Is that quite a common sign? And is there other signs and symptoms of prolonged grief?
Yeah, so I think that stuckness is something that's really important. I guess there can be lots of different ways, and I think that's where sort of an assessment when we're thinking about is somebody experiencing complicated grief, we would be exploring a lot of different areas because there's lots of things that can get in the way of being of that natural process. Sometimes it might be that somebody is really trying to actively avoid the painful feelings that grief brings up, and so they might be turning to drugs or alcohol, or they might just be cut off completely, or they might be experiencing some intrusive images of how the death happened. So there's a lot of different ways, and I probably won't cover all of them today, but there's lots of different ways. So that kind of talking with somebody to try to explore the reasons behind that stuckness. Yeah.
And is there circumstances perhaps in their life that might increase the likelihood of complicated grief? Perhaps they've had childhood trauma or trauma later on in their life. Yeah.
So certainly life experiences are going to have something to do with that. And I guess I think about, perhaps somebody maybe they've had some recent stressful life events that they haven't quite processed those, and now they've got a death of a loved one on top of that. And so that's something that's going to prolong that process. Sometimes people have unresolved previous losses, so maybe they haven't had a chance to kind of come to terms with maybe, say, losing a parent at a young age, and so all those old losses kind of come up when the new loss occurs, and so childhood experiences can definitely have an impact as well. So I guess some of the key things when you're talking about supporting someone through a grieving process are about some people, being able to kind of describe and talk about one's own emotional experiences and being able to trust that somebody else can help them. So if you were taught from a young age that having emotions are bad or makes you weak in some way or somehow discouraged, or maybe you didn't have loved ones who would listen and help support you. You may be many years later and you don't believe that actually talking to anybody might help, or that actually owning those emotions is going to be helpful. So that can certainly get in the way and prolong that grieving process.
That makes sense. And how about the actual circumstances surrounding the death? Not every death is a good death, as we know. Some shock, suicide, for example, as well. Sure. Does that have an impact on the likelihood of complicated grief?
Yeah, so I think it's useful to say something about, every death of a loved one that's close to us is traumatic. But there are certain circumstances in which we would kind of almost be using a traumatic with a capital T.
Yeah.
So like you mentioned, death by suicide, or especially when it's unexpected or maybe violent in some way. But also it could be kind of imagined. So the person might not have been there when the person died, but they imagine what had happened. Maybe they fear that they died alone, or they were in pain or in a lot of great suffering. That might stick with them, and they can get stuck in that. And so all they sort of remember about the person is the way that they died, not necessarily who the person was, or trying to kind of create a lasting bond with somebody, which are some of the things that we might do in a kind of a typical grieving process, and that are, I guess, goals for therapy if somebody is seeking that kind of help.
Can the death itself actually cause post-traumatic stress in people as well?
Certainly, I've definitely seen that. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of those things that's probably worth, I guess, explaining what that means. And that is when somebody experiences a traumatic incident. And a lot of the sort of the research, and people may have heard of PTSD in relation to things like military combat or a car accident or something along those lines. But we can also get it from witnessing what we see as a traumatic incident in others. So certainly, if they were with the person, or they imagine what the person might have been through and they were in a lot of suffering, that can be classed as traumatic enough to trigger PTSD. So you've got that image that is intrusive, that those memories or what they imagine might have happened coming back to them again and again. But it's also accompanied by a lot of fear, maybe anger, so quite intense emotions. And then there's a lot of avoidance. Some people with sort of PTSD caused by traumatic grief, they might be actually preoccupied with that. They kind of can't get that image out of their mind. But other people will go to great lengths to just not talk about it, not go near any reminders or anything. So there's those kind of 3 symptom clusters that we talk about in PTSD is what is classic. So we would be then, like I say, advising or looking at, maybe it would be helpful, as much as people don't want to go back and revisit what happened, that sometimes that's the most helpful thing is actually talking about it and making some sense out of it. Because often those memories that there are very disjointed, and it's almost like they're re-experiencing it again and again, like it just happened yesterday. Yeah. And it may be years down the line that they're reporting this as well.
I hope that you're finding this episode useful. Perhaps you have a question you'd like to ask. You can do this by commenting below. Your input shapes the conversations we have and the topics that we explore. So don't hesitate to reach out and let us know what you'd like to hear more of. And is there a difference between having prolonged grief or complicated grief and depression? Is there differences between the two?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I probably won't do it justice because there are volumes of books being read about that. But I guess in general, it's really hard because there's so much overlap between that typical grieving process and the symptoms of depression. So when we talk about depression, we're talking about low mood, we're talking about tearfulness, we're talking about difficulties eating and sleeping. All of those things happen in a typical grieving process. So it can be quite difficult. But we might be starting to think about depression when maybe the thoughts about lots of different things are quite negative or quite down. Maybe they're starting to think, having quite frequent thoughts of wanting to end their life, maybe even starting to make plans about that. And we're talking about perhaps, some people when they're depressed, they feel more agitated. It's not always that typical kind of hide under the duvet and sort of lack of energy and lack of motivation that a lot of people see. So there's some subtle differences. And I think, but we want to be kind of just really mindful that, with depression, things tend to be fairly static or it's worsening. Whereas with grief, you would be starting to see that people might start to experience over time that they have more good days than bad days. With depression, they might not be reporting that. It might just be all bad days. Yeah. And we would want to be waiting a period of time, but not too long. So it depends on the severity of that depression.
Okay. And if someone is listening to this and they're sort of recognising the symptoms of complicated grief in themselves, is there anything they can do to help themselves?
Well, I think when I was reflecting on this question, I thought about my own experiences in losing loved ones who are quite close to me. And there's sort of two things that really stand out that I think helped me and it's advice that I give to other people as well. One of them is about being kind to yourself. Allow yourself to feel those really sad emotions. Allow yourself to, take a break from things. Not too long of a break, but take a break, give yourself time to heal. And I think I was quite lucky because I've been studying human behavior for many, many years. And so I kind of had some idea of what to expect in the grieving process. And I think, that giving yourself that time to heal. If you think about, losing a loved one, I tend to think about like, how long does it take us to get used to the idea that people stick around? I think about babies, and if you've ever seen a baby who can play peekaboo for hours, it's because they don't expect the person to come back. Whatever they see in front of them is what's in front of them, and they may go through a period of time where you leave the room and they get really distressed because they just don't know that you're coming back. But over years and over months and years, they start to recognize, actually, mom can leave the room or dad can leave the room and they're going to come back. And so this is something that most of us, if we're lucky, we live with this for a long, long time, many, many years, that the person that we know and love, they're going to come back when they leave the room. Yeah. But when we're talking about when somebody dies, they don't come back. So it takes the brain a long time to adjust. And there's some people who suggest that we wouldn't, I guess, diagnose or even start to think about prolonged grief until at least a year has passed. Okay. Some people feel that that's too short, and we can't put a time on grief. And certainly there's definitely a huge gray area in that. And so that's one thing, is kind of give yourself that time to heal and be kind to yourself. The other thing is to accept help from others. Yeah. I think that's one thing that I learned, that there are lots of really kind, compassionate people out there. And when they say, if you want me to do anything, just ask, they actually mean it. Yeah. And you might need to do them a favor by telling them exactly what you need, because a lot of people don't know what to say or don't know what to do. That's very common. But that is one piece of advice that I am so glad that was given to me, and so glad that I followed as well. Yeah. And I think in addition to kind of just that helping that natural process along by sharing it with other people, it also means that you've got a bit of a safety net, that if things do become prolonged, or you do start to fall into depression, or it may be traumatic, or there's something complicated about the grieving process, that those people that are around you might be able to pick that up even quicker, or better than yourself will. You go through a very long period of numbing and kind of not knowing when you're going to get out the other end. Not that you ever do, you kind of learn to live with it rather than move past it.
And final question for you, Melissa. If someone listening to this today is really struggling, feels stuck in the grieving process, where can they get additional professional support?
If anyone's listening and they've been under the care of Forest Holme, so their loved one has been cared for by the palliative care team, then they are eligible for bereavement support through our team. And we offer things like befriending. We've got a Living with Loss workshop that gives you that sort of idea of what to expect in the grieving process, so you can be looking at, okay, is this kind of fitting in with what I've been told, or am I experiencing something that's a little bit different? We also have, there's a therapeutic bereavement group, and we offer individual counseling as well. So we've got that for other people. They might want to contact, there's, if they live in Dorset, there's Open Door, which is find the right bereavement support for you, and there's a phone number online that people can call. Or there's places like Cruise or the Loss Foundation who will offer support.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you for listening to the Life and Loss podcast. If you'd like more information on our work, you can visit our website, which is foresthomehospice.org.uk. Thank you. If you found this episode useful, click the subscribe button. Share this episode with a friend or loved one. And don't forget to give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means so much.